Elite Facts presents
9 interesting facts about Prohibition-era America.
9.
World War I helped enforce prohibition. Talks for prohibition started as early as the 19th century as religious revivalists and early teetotaler groups like the American Temperance Society campaigned relentlessly against what they viewed as a nationwide scourge of drunkenness. In 1851, the activists scored a major victory when the Maine legislature passed a statewide prohibition on selling alcohol. Following this, a dozen other states soon started to follow suit and instituted Maine laws of their own, only to repeal them a few years later after widespread opposition and riots from hooch-addicted citizens. Calls for a dry America continued into the 1910s when deep-pocketed and politically connected groups such as the Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christian Temperance Union gained widespread support for anti-alcohol legislation on Capitol Hill. Prohibition was pretty much a done deal by the time the United States entered World War I in 1917. However, the conflict served as one of the last nails in the coffin of legalized alcohol. Dry advocates argued that the barley used in brewing beer could instead be used to make bread to feed American soldiers and war-ravaged Europeans, and they succeeded in winning wartime bans on strong drinks. Crusaders against alcohol were often fueled by xenophobia, and the war allowed them to paint America's largely German brewing industry as a potential threat. Quote, "We have German enemies in this country too," one temperance politician argued, "and the worst of all our German enemies, the most treacherous, the most menacing, are Pabst, Schlitz, Blatz, and Miller."
8.
Alcohol technically wasn't illegal. So this is a common misconception, as most of us believe that prohibition downright outlawed alcohol altogether. This is in fact false, as the 18th Amendment only forbade the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors, not their consumption. By law, any wine, beer, or spirits that any American citizen had stored away in January of 1920 was theirs to keep and enjoy in the privacy of their homes. For most, this amounted to only a few bottles, but some affluent drinkers built cavernous wine cellars and even bought out whole liquor store inventories to ensure they had healthy stockpiles of legal booze.
7.
Women's independence. So if one thing positive came out of Prohibition, it was to be the fact that women started to find their own independence. During Prohibition, speakeasies inspired new forms of sociability between men and women. Before this, however, women were expected to stay home, but the new world of nightclubs and jazz paved the way for bob-haired flapper women who felt a new sense of independence and liberation. Although taboo, women enjoyed the nightlife in underground speakeasies, where it was socially acceptable for them to smoke, drink cocktails, and dance to the thrilling sounds of jazz. Men enjoyed the company of these pretty ladies, which bar operators used to attract more clientele. Above the door of a Manhattan speakeasy was a sign stating, quote, "Through these portals, the most beautiful women in the world pass." Small fact, it was during the Prohibition era that the term powder room arose for the ladies' toilets.
6.
Prohibition made cocktails more popular. Despite popular belief that the Prohibition era created the cocktail, it didn't. However, it did popularize the method. Prior to Prohibition, America was known for its exceptional cocktails. In fact, European bartenders traveled to the United States to learn and perfect the art of American mixology. Of course, when Prohibition took effect, this took a massive toll on experienced bartenders who were professionals in mixology. This left the most well-trained bartenders with only two options: either leave the U.S. to tend bars in Europe or find another trade. As a result, the U.S. was left with amateur bathtub gin and moonshine. The new liquor was much stronger than anything that could have been purchased before Prohibition. In fact, and arguably should come as no surprise given some of the stories about how strong the stuff is, moonshine was often used to fuel the vehicles that transported the illegal liquor to speakeasies. Although drinkable, the liquor was so strong that it was almost unbearable at times. To dilute the flavor, the martini and mixed drink culture that we relate with the Roaring '20s era was born.
5.
Drugstores continued to sell alcohol. So as you'd probably expect, a lot of companies took advantage of certain loopholes that were overlooked during Prohibition's early days. The Volstead Act included a few interesting exceptions to the ban on distributing alcohol. Sacramental wine was still permitted for religious purposes. The number of questionable rabbis and priests soon skyrocketed, as you'd probably expect. And drugstores were allowed to sell medicinal whiskey to treat everything from toothaches to the flu. With a physician's prescription, patients could legally buy a pint of hard liquor. The only catch was that you could only purchase 1 pint every 10 days. This pharmaceutical booze often came with seemingly laughable doctor's orders, such as take 3 ounces every hour for stimulant until stimulated. As you'd probably expect, many speakeasies jumped on the bandwagon and eventually operated under the guise of being pharmacies, and legitimate chains flourished.
4,
Winemakers found creative ways to stay in business. While many small distilleries and breweries secretly continued production of alcohol during the Prohibition, the rest had to either shut their doors or find new uses for their factories. Yuengling and Anheuser-Busch both refitted their breweries to make ice cream, while Coors doubled down on the production of pottery and ceramics. Could you imagine Jean-Claude Van Damme in a Coors advertisement making pottery while blurting out absolute gibberish? Actually, that's not too far off from the original commercials. Other companies would take an alternative route and produce near beer. Near beer was a legal brew that contained less than 0.5% alcohol. The lion's share of brewers kept the lights on by peddling malt syrup, a legally dubious extract that could be easily made into beer by adding water and yeast and allowing time for fermentation. Winemakers followed a similar route by selling chunks of grape concentrate called wine bricks.
3,
Speakeasies. You know that trope that appears in films and television where there's a guy who guards a door and only opens it up to people who know the secret word? Well, you have the Prohibition era to thank for that. The intention of Prohibition was to make America dry. However, the law backfired in proportions unimaginable to those who enforced and preached for the sobriety of a nation. Following the amendment, New Jersey claimed that there were 10 times as many watering holes as before. In fact, it was thought that New York had as many as 100,000 speakeasies, twice the number prior to Prohibition. So let's say for every bar that had to close down thanks to the new laws implemented, another 3 bars would be opened in its place. Without the need to adhere to previous standards imposed on bar owners, such as trading and licensing agreements, men would run to their basements, make quick renovations, and open their own bars and cash in. The police force was powerless, so much so that there were 4 recorded speakeasies on the same street as the Boston Police Department.
2,
Al Capone's reign. Alfonso Capone is one of the first things your mind is drawn to when thinking about the Prohibition era. Why? Well, because he was pretty much the king during that time period. Sure, you have the likes of John Dillinger and Enoch Johnson. However, Capone is the guy we all associate with this time period. Now, there are gangsters out there who've done worse things than good old Mr. Capone here. However, what sets Capone aside from the others is the sheer fact that he was even feared by fellow gangsters. More famously known as the real Scarface, Al Capone was an American gangster who pioneered the crime world during the Prohibition era by having his hand in businesses such as liquor smuggling and prostitution. At a very young age, he became a member of a notorious gang in New York and engaged in different illegal activities such as bribery among government officials. Capone was certainly no pushover. If he had a problem, he would take care of it in the most brutal way possible. Hence the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where 7 people were brutally shot down. Still not convinced? Remember that scene in the Untouchables movie where Capone, played by Robert De Niro, brutally killed one of his own henchmen with a baseball bat to prove a point during a sit-down meeting? Well, apparently that wasn't a work of fiction, and that reportedly happened on May 7, 1929. Within 2 years, Capone was earning $60 million from alcohol sales alone, allowing him to bribe both the police and politicians. A few years before he died, he led a Prohibition-era crime syndicate and was brought down by Detective Elliot Ness on the grounds of tax evasion. He spent the rest of his life behind bars on Alcatraz Island.
1,
The end. After 13 years of alcoholic hijinks, Prohibition would finally come to an end in 1933. The main reason for this law being lifted was for the simple reason that it was having too much of a negative effect on America's economy. The high price of bootleg liquor meant that the nation's working class and poor were far more restricted during Prohibition than middle or upper class Americans. Not only did it have a severe impact on citizens of all social groups, but it also had a massive impact on the law itself, as even costs for law enforcement, jails, and prisons only spiraled upwards. In addition, fundamentalist and nativist forces had gained more control over the temperance movement, alienating its more moderate members. With the country deep into the Great Depression in 1932, the only solution to saving the country's economy was by abolishing prohibition laws, thus creating jobs and revenue. Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt ran for president that year on a platform calling for Prohibition's repeal and easily won victory over the incumbent president Herbert Hoover. FDR's victory meant the end for Prohibition, and in February 1933, Congress adopted a resolution proposing a 21st Amendment to the Constitution that would repeal the 18th. Even though Prohibition was lifted, a select few states continued to prohibit alcohol after Prohibition's end, but by the time 1966 came around, all states abandoned the ban altogether.
Don't forget to like us and subscribe for more elite facts.